The Mask of Charm, The Crimes of Paul Bernardo. In the late 1980s, the Toronto suburbs carried a quiet fear that rarely made the news outside of Ontario. By day, Scarborough was an ordinary working-class community filled with busy streets, shopping plazas, and high school kids hanging around convenience stores. But by night, the atmosphere shifted. Women walking home alone felt the hairs on their necks rise. Families double-checked their locks. A predator was lurking, one who struck without mercy, vanishing before police could ever catch up. He became known only as the Scarborough Rapist. The crimes were brutal, sudden, and eerily calculated. And behind the mask of this shadowy figure was a man no one would have suspected. A clean-cut, handsome young man named Paul Bernardo. Sees the crime. Paul Bernardo's reign of terror began in 1987. His attacks all carried a chillingly similar pattern. He would stalk women late at night, often near bus stops or dark residential streets. When he struck, he was fast and violent, dragging them into secluded areas, threatening them with knives, and leaving them with physical and psychological scars that would last a lifetime. Over the span of 5 years, at least 13 women fell victim to the Scarborough Rapist. Police plastered the city with warnings, urging women not to walk alone. Mothers begged their daughters to travel in groups. My own mother, working as a security guard at the time in Scarborough, recalled how the tension was thick in the air. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every quiet street corner was a trap waiting to be sprung. But the rapist always seemed one step ahead. Police interviewed dozens of suspects. At one point, even Paul Bernardo himself. But his polished, charming demeanor convinced them he couldn't possibly be their man. The revelation. What no one knew was that Paul Bernardo was living a double life. To friends and co-workers, he was attractive, charismatic, and ambitious. He had the easy charm of someone who could talk his way out of anything. He wore crisp suits, smiled easily, and seemed destined for financial success. But beneath that mask of normalcy was a sadistic streak. Even in his personal relationships, disturbing signs surfaced. He demeaned girlfriends, grew obsessed with control, and nurtured violent fantasies. In 1987, he met a young veterinary student named Karla Homolka. Together, they became one of the most infamous duos in Canadian history. At first, Karla seemed like his opposite, sweet, blonde, friendly. But she quickly fell under his spell, indulging his darkest desires. Instead of pulling him away from violence, she fueled it. The investigation. Police were under enormous pressure. The Scarborough Rapist had become a household name, and the public demanded answers. Dozens of victims described the same attacker, and yet every lead seemed to fizzle. At one point, DNA samples were collected from hundreds of men. Paul Bernardo was among them. He handed over his sample casually, confident he could keep up his act. For months, those results sat in a backlog, untested, while Bernardo escalated. In December 1990, Bernardo's crimes took an even darker turn. With Karla by his side, he kidnapped and murdered 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffy. The young girl had been locked out of her house one night when Bernardo spotted her. He and Karla held her captive for hours, recording their sadistic torture on videotape before killing her and encasing her body in concrete. The brutality stunned investigators. They knew the Scarborough Rapist was violent, but this was something else entirely. Just months later, in April 1992, the couple struck again, abducting 15-year-old Kristen as she walked home from school. She too was videotaped, tortured, and killed. Now, police were no longer looking for a rapist. They were hunting murderers. And the moment of truth. The breakthrough finally came in 1993. Karla Homolka, after years of complicity, began to fear for her own safety. Paul's abuse turned inward. He was violent not just with strangers, but with her. In desperation, she turned to her family and eventually to police. She confessed her involvement in the murders and pointed the finger at Bernardo. But her cooperation came at a cost. She struck a plea deal, later infamously dubbed the deal with the devil. In exchange for testifying against Paul, she was given a relatively light sentence of 12 years. It was only after this deal was signed that investigators uncovered the videotapes, the horrifying evidence showing both Paul and Karla participating in the assaults and murders. On those tapes, it was clear Karla was not simply a bystander, but an active participant. But by then, the deal was done. The public erupted in outrage. Many believed Karla had manipulated the system just as Paul had manipulated her. While Bernardo was eventually convicted in 1995 of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts of sexual assault, and sentenced to life in prison with no parole, Karla would walk free in 2005. The emotional aftermath. The story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka left scars far beyond their victims. For the families of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen French, the pain was immeasurable. Their daughter's final moments had been turned into grotesque trophies by sadists. For survivors of the Scarborough rapist, the trial brought both vindication and renewed trauma. They had lived for years knowing their attacker was still out there. Now, they learned he had gone on to kill. And for the community, people like my mom working nights in Scarborough, checking over her shoulder, the case confirmed their worst fears. The charming young man next door, the one who smiled and shook your hand, could also be a monster. Even today, decades later, Paul Bernardo's name sends shivers through Canada. His crimes forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about manipulation, justice, and evil hiding in plain sight. The legacy: Paul Bernardo remains behind bars, serving a life sentence. His parole hearings in recent years have reignited anger, with victims' families passionately fighting to ensure he is never released. His lack of remorse, his calculated cruelty, and the sheer scale of his crimes all point to one conclusion: Paul Bernardo will die in prison. Karla Homolka, however, remains one of the most controversial figures in Canadian crime history. Though she served her 12 years, her attempt to reintegrate into society has been met with outrage, protests, and headlines each time her name resurfaces. The case stands as a chilling reminder: monsters don't always come with snarling faces or frightening masks. Sometimes they wear suits, smile politely, and live right next door.